what happens after fires. So we have 3 great speakers lined up. We have Dr. Julie Korb, who's going to focus on vegetation and vegetation responses to fire. And we have Andy Gleason from Fort Lewis, who's going to focus more on erosion and debris flows following fire. And then last, Scott Roberts from Mountain Studies Institute, who's going to focus more on the aquatic components of things. But before we get started, I just want to give a huge shout out to Emily Swindell here in red, who has really done all of the back end planning of these events and made this happen. So thanks, Emily, for making all of this happen. And she's the one who got the food here and got this all set up for us to enjoy. So thanks to Emily. And then also a huge thanks to our partners and sponsors. In the back, we don't have a representative, but San Juan Citizens Alliance was a sponsor in this, and so they have some stickers back there if you want to pick up some stickers from them. Huge thanks to their support. We've got folks from Colorado State Forest Service, folks from Wildfire Adaptive Partnership, both are huge partner organizations from Mountain Studies Institute, and then other partners that aren't here are Southwest, well, who else is it?
Southern Rocky Fire Science Network. Then we have the Headwaters 232, the Dolores Watershed, Resilience Partnership, and Mountain Studies Institute.
Great. So
yeah,
huge.
San Juan National Forest, U.S. Forest Service, been huge help in this. Yeah. And of course the Powerhouse. Thank you very much.
Huge thanks to the Powerhouse for hosting this. So without further ado, the way this evening is going to be structured is we're going to have our 3 presenters each talk for about 20 minutes. And then we're going to shift gears to a question and answer session or a discussion session. So there will be a short break after our 3 speakers, and then when we transition to the discussion section, you'll have opportunities to ask all of our speakers questions. So please hold questions for each individual speaker until that discussion session at the end. So first up, Dr. Julie Korb from Fort Lewis.
All right.
Requested. So I'm going to stand here. I wish I had a podium with a screen so that I don't like to put my back to people, but I think if I stand here, I'm going to see my face, at least I don't put my back to you. So I'm going to talk about post-fire vegetation responses and subsequent impacts on watershed health, but primarily I'm really just talking about the vegetation. I'm going to let Andy talk about the effects on flooding and erosion and those sorts of things. Let's start my camera too. Right now. All right. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the Missionary Ridge Fire in the context of what we can expect with the 416 fire. So in 2002, the Missionary Ridge Fire burned approximately 72,000 acres, and of that, 30% was moderate burn severity and 31% was high burn severity. And then in 2018, we had the 416 fire, and that was approximately 53,000 acres, and we had 30% moderate burn severity and 3% high burn severity. And for these maps, these came from the BEAR report, which is the Burn Area Emergency Response. And so this is looking at the effects on soil. So it's not looking at the effects on vegetation, it's looking at the effects on soil, which is important to note because the effects on vegetation and soil can be different. But what we can see is that in both of these areas, we did have similar, well actually it was the exact same, moderate burn severity, but there was quite a difference in the high burn severity. And so when we look at the impacts that it can have on watershed health, those high burn severity areas are the ones that we tend to focus on with flooding, and I'll let Andy talk more about that next. So just to put this in context of why we're interested in vegetation responses, there's 4 main variables that affect post-fire recovery, and the timing of that and the extent of it. So it's highly dependent on burn severity, and so when I talk about severity, it's different than intensity. So intensity is the physical force of the amount of energy released from the fire, and what I'm referring to here is burn severity. There it is, right, okay. I'm focusing on burn severity. And then the next thing is looking at what's the vegetation type. So in both of these fires, we had areas that burned from juniper into higher elevation forests where we had some subalpine fir and Engelmann spruce. And so that vegetation type has an impact on the post-vegetation response. And we'll see that when we look at some of the preliminary data from the 416 fire and the data that we have from Missionary Ridge. The next variable that affects post-fire recovery is looking at precipitation, and so that's the intensity and the duration of that. And then finally, looking at the topographic variable is looking at the slope. So those four variables are what then affects the post-fire recovery, looking at watershed health. And so this is just a photo of Stevens Creek post Missionary Ridge fire. This is one of those big reflows that happen post Missionary Ridge. Here we have the Hermosa Creek drainage. As you go up towards the Hermosa Creek campground, you can see there's a lot of high severity burn that happen on the northeast facing slope. And so looking at those areas as a potential place where you can see some flooding events. All right, and then the reason why, again, like I said, that we want to look at this vegetation is because it does have a direct correlation to the hydrological and erosion function post-fire. So in an intact system, we have vegetation. What you have when it rains, you get this rain splash, so the rain will fall, it'll hit the vegetation. If it hits the soil, you'll get soil particles that go up, but they go back down. When you have areas that have been partially denuded through fire, what you end up getting is sheet flow, so that's a thin layer of water that moves across the entire surface. And then when you have these areas that burn, you have 100% or high soil burn severity, then you're able to get these concentrated flows where that water can then gather, gain momentum, and it starts forming rills and gullies, and it can actually move a lot of sediment. So these were the maps that the burn area emergency response put out post Missionary Ridge fire, and you can see the probability of the debris flow. So right here, the key here is this is looking at the precipitation that I talked about, so the intensity and duration. So they modeled this for a ½ inch rainfall in 30 minutes, and then took into consideration the vegetation type, the burn severity, and then it also took into consideration slope. And so you can then see in these areas, there were some areas that were 75 to 100% probability of these debris flow occurrences, and one of those was in the Stevens Creek drainage. Here's the 416 fire, here's going up with the Hermosa Creek, and then right here are some of those slopes that I was talking about, and you see as you drive up to the Hermosa Creek campground. So again, they've been mapped to be, the model to be 60 to 100% probability of a debris flow. But one of the important things to think about is that this map, because now we're 17 years post-fire, this map is no longer, you can't really apply it to the fire because we've had that vegetation that's not been established. I'm going to show you some images from the Missionary Ridge burn area, post 1 year post-fire and then post 15 years fire. Where this map is still, you can apply it to what's going on in 416. So one of the things that I did with one of my students, okay, we created this website. So in 2002 after the fire, one of the things that I wanted to do was go out. I worked with Gretchen Fitzgerald and some other folks to go out into the Missionary Ridge burn area, and we established 840 permanent plots throughout the entire burn area. And in that burn area, we then went out and sampled years 1 post-fire, years 2, 3, and then we got some funding to do 100 of our plots. We sampled 15 years post-fire. Kind of look at that vegetation trajectory to see how this area responded across time. And then I'll show you some data to show you how I think the data that we're seeing in Missionary Ridge can then apply to the 416 burn area. So if you want to go, so if you want to check this out, this is on this website, and there's photo comparison maps, there's time lapse, and there's a bunch of information. And we'll end up putting our data on this website as well. So here are some of the monitoring plots. This is one of our high burn severity monitoring plots. So right here, this is 1 year post-fire. So you can see there's good vegetation establishment, even in this high burn severity. Got a bunch of grasses growing back in. And then this is 15 years post-fire. So you can see what's come in is there's a lot of aspen. But you can think about, from a watershed standpoint, how this change over time is going to affect degree flows. Here's another one of our permanent plots that we have. This is up by Aceto now. This is a high severity burn area. This is 1 year post-fire. So here is a different community. So it's more dominated by conifers of pine. So instead of having aspen as the dominant vegetation that's moving up and reestablishing, you can see there was some oak sprouts. They weren't that high. They were only about a foot or so high 1 year. And then here, 15 years post-fire, you can see a lot of those trees, the dead standing snags, they now fell and they're part of the forest floor. And you have this oak response. Again, by having all that vegetation, it starts stabilizing this way. This is another photo series. This is, again, on the left, it's 1 year post-fire. So again, this is a high conifer, but it also had aspen present. And then you can see that this basically is switched over to an aspen-dominated forest. So switching from a previous conifer-dominated forest to an aspen deciduous. And then this is just the last series that I'm going to show. So on the left, bare soil, and this was a steep slope. And you can see in this photo, unlike the other ones, there weren't a lot of shrubs. So this area took a lot longer to reestablish post-fire. So it was getting reestablished by perennial grasses and thorns. And so you don't have a dominant cover like you do in areas where you have those sprouting species that can respond immediately post-fire. But you do have a lot of the snags that were previously standing now as forest relief debris on the forest floor. And so one of the things to think about then is the potential of a reburn in these areas. That in all those areas, there's plenty of fuel. So even though we had a fire go through, a lot of people say, oh, it won't burn there again. But when you go out and really look at what's on the ground, you know that there's enough fuel that if conditions were right, then you're going to see fire in those areas. All right, so here's some data. Just going to check. We've got 10 minutes. Okay, so the way this is set up, this is looking at live trees per acre, 1 to 15 years post-fire, in low, moderate, high severity. So on this y-axis, this is just the number of live trees per acre. Down below on the x, we're just looking at different diameter classes, how big the trees are. And so this first panel is looking at 1 year post-fire. The second panel is looking at 15 years post-fire. And so one of the things to look at is the difference. So we have a good diversity of tree species present in the low, moderate, and high severity that were alive 1 year post-fire. There is a pretty similar amount of trees per acre. When we look at 15 years post-fire, we can see that there's a 26 decrease in live trees between post-year 1 and 15. There's a 52% decrease between live trees year 1 and 15. And then actually in the high severity, we actually had a 3% increase. But you can see this green, this is all aspen. So again, it's just transitioning from a forest that used to be dominated by conifers, now it's dominated by aspen. So the main take-home point is that there's a decrease in live trees between year 1 and 15. And so that's something to think about for the 416 fire. Because when you go out and you do an initial survey 1 year post-fire, you're basically assessing what trees are alive. But some of the crown of those canopies, they might be 50% alive, 40%. And so what I'm going to show you is some of the plots that Mike with MSI has put in that I was working with him is to look at the percent canopy crown so that we can get an idea of, okay, if it's 30% live canopy, will actually live or not? So we can then help land managers have a better idea of whether those trees are going to live or not, and we don't have to wait 15 years to find out whether or not we're going to have those trees still part of the system. And then the other thing just to note is that 15 years post-fire, conifers and pine trees had the highest survival rate post-fire. So of those trees that did survive, they were conifers and pine, which makes sense. Conifers and pine is highly adapted to fire. It has really thick bark. and so it makes sense. But it's also good to see that those ponderosa pine trees did survive 15 years post-fire. This is just looking at tree regeneration. So this is set up the exact same way as the last figure. So y-axis tree regeneration, we have low severity, moderate, high, year 1 and year 15. So the key thing here is that 1 year post-fire, we had abundant aspen regen, and we also did have conifer regeneration present. So again, the green is aspen, it's different shades of brown are conifers. So here, this pink is Doug fir, and the brown, which you don't see a lot of, is ponderosa pine. So we're not seeing a lot of ponderosa pine regen. And then when we move on and we go back to these sites 15 years post-fire, what we see is that there's a lack of small regeneration. So that's this first column, and so that is anything below breast height. So any trees regen below breast height. Basically what we're seeing is that immediately post-fire, we're seeing abundant regeneration in those smaller diameter classes. 15 years post-fire, basically, you're not getting that regeneration response anymore. But one of the things that we do see here is that some of these smaller trees, 15 years later, in the low severity and the moderate, and these are ponderosa pine, but they are present in these two burn severities, but primarily basically in the high severity, it's aspen. So you're not getting that regeneration of the conifer trees. So key point, diversity of large regeneration, 15 years post-fire for low and moderate, aspen though is dominant in high severity. This is looking at shrub cover, 1 to 15 years post-fire for low, moderate, and high burn severity. Again, we have abundance. This is now percent cover. And here we're looking at 1 year post-fire in this column, and we're looking at 15 years post-fire in the second column. And the big take-home point is that for both year 1 and year 15, it's dominated by sporadic species, Campbell's oak and snowberry. So this green is Quercus gabelii, which is Campbell's oak, and then this pink is Bocarpus rotundifolia, which is snowberry. And both of these species, they both sprout through an underground system. The other key take-home point is that there's no significant change between year 1 and year 15. So even though there are slight differences, it's not significantly different. So that's kind of interesting to think about then the 416 fire, to say, okay, what we're seeing on the 416 fire as far as shrub response 1 year post-fire, most likely is what we're going to be seeing, shrub response year 15 post-fire in the 416 fire. So that's why having these comparison data sets are really useful to have. So moving on to the 416 fire, so this summer MSI with the Forest Service got some funding. Mike, who introduced me, went out with a crew. Emily was on that crew, some others. They established 8 tree understory plots for burn severity, so 24. So it's a small sample size compared to what we did in Missionary, where we had 840 permanent plots. And the goal is, Mike and I just wrote a grant. Hopefully we're going to be getting funding. We're going to have a big crew that's going to be going out this summer to add in a bunch more of these plots to increase our data set. But it's always good to kind of get just do some reconnaissance and kind of see what's happening. And then the other thing, 15 regeneration plots for conifers were established into the burn severities. So what did we find? So this is looking at dead trees now. So these aren't live trees. So on the y-axis, we're looking at dead trees per acre. And this is just year 1. So this was collected this summer, and Mike put this together for me so I can share it with you. We're looking at low severity, moderate, and high again. Key thing here, you can see there's a diversity of species. But one of the things that I found interesting is that there is aspen present. And so we're going to look at the next slide. We're going to see that there was no live aspen present post-fire, but it was a part of this pre-fire environment. So most of the aspen got killed, which makes sense because the stems, it has really thin bark, so it's super susceptible to individual trees dying, but the clone itself is actually sustained. And we'll see that in some of our regen plots. And so one of the things I looked at is I looked at the community composition of both the live and dead trees. And what's interesting, and Mike and I were talking about this, and it makes sense looking at how these different areas burn, is that for the low severity, we kind of looked at what the low and the moderate severity forest looked like prior to the fire. Both of those areas were dominated by ponderosa pine. So to me, that indicates that these forests were more in line with what we call warm, dry mixed conifer. They're dominated by ponderosa pine, so their historical fire regime is more in line with ponderosa pine. So primarily surface fires, you can get mixed severity fires. Some areas you can get pockets that burn really hot and burn high severity. In our high severity burn areas, they were dominated by Douglas fir, white fir, and aspen. And there was just a really small component of ponderosa pine. So this would be more in line with our cool, moist mixed conifer forests. And so cool, moist mixed conifer forests historically, prior to your American settlement, they burned more of a mixed severity fire and also as a crown fire. So the fact that this is what the forest type was prior and that's how it burned, we tend to say, okay, anytime we see crowning maybe these fires, that is somehow bad. But if we actually look at the research of how these fires burned historically in this forest type, this is pretty much in alignment. So it burned with how we would expect it to burn based on evolutionary history traits of all these different species. So that was pretty interesting when I was going through this last night, putting this talk together. I was like, oh, this all makes sense. So this is looking at live trees per acre then. Again, on the y-axis, we have live trees, different diameter size classes. So this is looking at, so what I did is I just took the dead and live trees, and then I looked at how much of a decrease did we see. So on average, and again, we have to keep in mind this is just a small sample size. It's only 8 plots, so it's giving us kind of a snapshot view of what's going on. So in our low severity areas, approximately 35% of all the trees died during the burn. And given what we saw with the Missionary Ridge Fire, we know that's going to be more because we're going to see a decrease. In the moderate, approximately 58% decreased from what the stand density was prior to the burn. And then the high severity burn area, about 88% of those trees died. But again, similar to the Missionary Ridge Fire, one of the key points is that ponderosa pine trees have the highest survival rate post-fire. And again, it makes sense, this is in line with those evolutionary adaptation traits. This is looking at tree regeneration. So this looks a little different than what we saw in Missionary Ridge. Remember Missionary Ridge, 1 year post-fire? That's my You don't even have to tell me, Mike, that I'm running out of time. I'm almost there. So here, the green, this is aspen. So remember I showed you with the dead trees that there was aspen present, that they were killed. Then when we looked at the live trees, there wasn't. But this shows that those clones are intact, right? So in all the different burn severities, we're seeing a big response of aspen 1 year post-fire, and then the conifer regeneration is low or absent. We're really not seeing much of anything. I think right there, it's probably like 1 seedling that they got, and then 1 seedling of Davies coniflora white fir. This is looking at shrub cover. So again, we're looking at low, moderate, and high. This is percent cover. Just to compare it to Missionary, I did some totals. So the low severity cover in Missionary was about 40%. The moderate, it was about 60%. And then in the high severity, it was also around 50% for shrub cover in Missionary for all the plots. Here it's only 6% total. But what's going on again, remember it's a different veg type. So it's dominated, it's more of that cool, moist mixed conifer. So you're not going to see gamazode and snowberry as prevalent in those systems. And so that's why we're going to get that aspen response. So you are getting a sprouting response. It's just from a tree instead of a shrub. These are just some of the monitoring plots. I dragged Mike out with me last week with 90 Anna's high school freshmen and sophomore students. And we talking about fire ecology. This is just a low severity burn plot. And again, you can look at that canopy crown to kind of see what's going on, whether these trees will live. This is one of our high severity burn areas. And I'm just going to give, this is a paper that just came out well, it's not coming out until December, but I just got access to share it with people. So if somebody wants it, I can share it with you. So I'm the primary author on what drives conifers and pine regeneration following wildfire in the western United States. And what we did is we basically did a meta-analysis looking at all the research that's been done, looking at post-fire regeneration in conifers and pine across the western U.S. And then we came up and we looked at and identified that there were 21 factors that people had looked at for correlations of what drives conifers and pine regeneration. And the ones that basically stood out was climatic stress, elevation, and then distance to seed source. This is just a study that kind of shows you how even in, so here, this is a low severity burn, you get lots of regeneration. This is moderate, where you have a seep wall, still getting regeneration into this high severity burn area. And then even this area where it's high severity burn, if you have isolated patches of trees that can serve as a seed source, you can still get regeneration going on. And so this is just a schematic on the landscape. So here's, you can see it's near the seed wall right here. This is low severity. This was a high severity burn area that's right adjacent to the seed wall. This is a high severity burn area. Still, with isolated pockets of conifers and pine, you're still getting regeneration in that core area. And so the last slide, Mike whipped this up for me. This is a climate water deficit map. And so the green areas are basically showing areas that are wet. These red and orange variables, areas are showing areas that are dry. And so one of the things that I want to do with my plan is take the findings that we have from our research paper and then do some modeling in the 416 burn area, looking at this climatic water deficit, looking at distance to seed source, and then looking at elevation, and then modeling for land managers where we can expect to see conifers and pine regeneration, and then also where we might have to do some planting. So that is it. Hopefully, I didn't go over time.
I'm up next. I'm Andy Gleason. I'm in the Geosciences department at Fort Lewis College, and I'll talk about the post-fire landscape response. So I'll mostly be talking about debris flows. When the Missionary Ridge fire occurred, I was working for the Colorado Geological Survey, and I've been working in conjunction with Sue Cannon from the USGS for a number of years, doing post-fire debris flow analysis. And some of the modeling that Julie referred to, I was part of the team that did that and created those maps post-Missionary Ridge. So worked on a bunch of them on the Front Range as well. Oh, can you hear me? Should I use this? Okay, I'll use this, sorry. So I worked on a number of debris flows on the Front Range as well, ones outside of Glenwood and all over Colorado. All right, so what I like to say is natural disasters are just humans getting in the way of geologic processes. So here's a debris flow on Stevens Creek photo that I took. And you can see that there's a number of large boulders that went right into this house. If you look closely, one of them knocked the front door open and filled the house with 2 feet of water debris. All right, so I'm going to start out with the Missionary Ridge fire in June, July of 2002. I remember it well because my daughter was born right in the middle of it, and we lived in Silverton at the time. And the day that the fire jumped the road and they closed Highway 550 was the day my wife went into labor, of course. And begged them to let us go through and have their daughter. I wanted to name her Sparky, but that didn't work. So here's the outline of the Missionary Ridge burn fire. As Julie said, about 72,000 acres. Here's a burn severity map, about 31% severely burned, 39% lightly burned or unburned. So I'm going to be talking about the post-fire response. And one of the responses is debris flow. And the debris flow is a mixture of soil and water and rock. So the papers always say mudslide, but as a geomorphologist, I get upset by that, and it's really a debris flow because it has rocks and boulders in it. it can carry huge boulders. And the reason is that when the water is laden with sediment, its density is higher, its viscosity is higher, and so it's more buoyant. And it can lift a large boulder much more easily than just a flood or a hyper-concentrated flood. They can move very fast, and they typically run where there's previous channels before, although with the 416 fire, we found them in areas where we hadn't before. So this is the part of the map that Julie showed, and I was on the team that wrote the algorithm for this and did the debris flow response. So after a fire, the bear team comes in. I was on the bear team, and within 2 weeks, we create a debris flow hazard map. And it is based on burn severity, the slope, also the soil type, and the water repellency or hydrophobicity of the soil. And the way that that works is when you have any clay in the soil and you get a fire, it bakes the clay just like a clay pot will bake in a kiln, and it becomes more watery. When that happens, you don't get as much soil infiltration. So a smaller rainfall has a lot more downstream response because it runs off instead of infiltrating into the soil. So you get a lot more severe runoff than you would if you had vegetation intercepting the rain and the soil infiltrate. We use a very sophisticated method to measure hydrophobicity. We use a spatula and some water. So you take a little piece of soil and you rub it with a spatula, you put a drop of water on it, and you see how long it takes to infiltrate and come up with the degree of hydrophobicity of the soil. So then we ran a model based on all these parameters, and we looked at a 5-year rainstorm, a 25-year rainstorm, and a 100-year rainstorm. And it's based on the intensity of the rainfall. From a ½ an inch in an hour to 1.8 inches of water in an hour. And we came up with very different responses. And those responses are based on discharge in cubic feet per second of debris flow material coming into the different basins, in the different watersheds within the building. Part of my job with the Colorado Geological Survey was to get this map out into the public. So it was a terrible job because I had to go to places where someone's house had burned down and the neighbors hadn't. And I had to come by and say, okay, your house survived. Guess what? You survived the fire. Guess what you have to expect? And that's the debris flow. And nobody knew what it was. But we came in before they happened, before the monsoon, and warned people to create mitigation or to be ready for some sort of debris flow in their area. So once that started to occur, we had a regular monsoon season after the fires in July and August of 2002, and we started to get debris flows. So debris flows have incredible geomorphic power. That means that they can move a lot of material really fast. One thing they do is that they incise a channel, or they erode a channel all the way down to bedrock in some cases. So this is just outside of Lemon Reservoir, and you can see that this debris flow channel has gone right down to the bedrock. That's County Manager Flochino for reference, for scale. One way that these debris flows move material is called sediment bulking. And sediment bulking is this process where these channels will eventually fill in. If you go back to this channel today, it's starting to fill in. So when you have a light rainstorm, you have material moving down the slope through overland flow, sheet flow, and it slowly builds that material back up into that drainage. When it builds up over a number of years, then if you get a severe storm event after a fire, the vegetation is now gone, so it's not holding the root structure is no longer holding the soil in place. It's become water repellent or hydrophobic, so that it runs off more quickly, and it moves the material down and incises and erodes all that material that had bulked into the creek. Here is an area that's well below the severe burn, or really any burn area, right outside of Viacita. And when the rains came, they didn't hit the area that was burned up above. They only came through this one particular drainage, and in about a quarter mile of channel incision, it created this debris here. This debris was about 30 feet deep. There's a very large ditch right here that goes underneath the road next to Viacita. Here is aerial photo of Stevens Creek, which had one of the largest drainage areas from the Missionary Ridge Fire, and it moved boulders up to about 22 feet in diameter. So it was one of the largest debris flow responses. What's that building on the left? That is a private house. So how do fires and debris flows interact? When you have a fire and you get vegetation removed and you get hydrophobicity, it causes much more severe runoff response. And this causes debris flows. One of our students at Fort Lewis College, Jed Frechette, did a study where he looked at an 18-foot deep channel incision from the Missionary Ridge Fire and found a number of charcoal layers, and then carbon dated those charcoal layers to see how often debris flows and fires coincide. And another student, Erica Biggio, who's working on a PhD on this now, this is a figure from her research, shows debris flows. You see the debris flows here, and then burn layers in between. And at least what Jed Frechette found was that about, for the last couple thousand years, there's been a major fire and a subsequent debris flow about every 400 years. And they have a very distinct relationship. You get a fire, and then you get a large debris flow event. So the fan morphology itself is based on wildfire. So it's a much stronger relationship than we had thought before. Here's another geomorphic response to debris flow. This is a granite boulder that exploded in the heat. This is up above Viacita. You can see a rock hammer there for scale. So the debris flow is not the only response that we see. Also, I did some modeling analysis with the USGS. We used a flood model called Flow 2D, and it's generally used for urban flood modeling. But we use this model for debris flow by just pumping up the viscosity a little bit, so that instead of water, it was debris flow. And we ran the model on all of the basins within the Missionary Ridge Fire to determine possible depths in feet if a large-scale debris flow did occur. And this is one on Stevens Creek that shows potential going all the way down Animas River quite a ways away, over a mile away. I'll show you a couple of these. Here's one on Freeman Creek going into the Viacita Reservoir. You can see that in some cases it was modeled to be up to 15 feet deep with the debris. And in fact, we did see some debris up to 30 feet deep in certain areas, but mostly where there was already drainage that got plugged and bulged and filled in. All right, so what are some of the responses that we had to these debris flows? So we had to mitigate it, and some of the mitigation was sort of typical of debris flows, but some I thought was really innovative that applied now. This is Stevens Creek, where it crosses County Road 250. And they knew that the debris flow would come down and clog up any kind of culvert that they had put down. So what they did instead were made these removable panels of concrete. You see them from the side. You can see that they're not actually attached to the road. They're just sitting on this little ledge, so that if the debris flow comes, it can take them out. And we have more of these sitting in the yard that you just put them back in a few hours instead of having to rebuild an entire bridge. really innovative way to mitigate the debris flows. This is a picture of the house where I started off the slideshow where the boulders had knocked on the door and filled the house with debris. Some of the other mitigation is as simple as signage on the ground. So they put flood hazard instead of debris flow. I guess so they wouldn't get a lot of calls asking what debris flows were. At least they didn't put mudslide. And these come on when they get severe rainstorms, and the county state managers think that debris flows are going to occur. Some mitigation was relatively unsanctioned. So this is a house on the way up to Lemon Reservoir, and we visited him the day that his garage was built in 6 feet. And the next day, he had built this debris flow berm on his own to divert it away from his house and garage. What he didn't realize is that when you're making any kind of berm to deflect debris flow, if you try to move more than about 25 degrees off its natural course, it will simply flood and go over the berm. But so far, it seems to have worked for me. This is a house behind the country store on the north end of Montecito. And before this berm was made, this was an area that had severe debris flow potential hazard. And I went to talk to them, and at the time they had a small debris flow berm. They read about us in the paper. They knew that they had potential to get hit, so they made a 2-foot berm that went straight across the back of their house. And I came up to them and I said, I know you tried, but it's really not going to work. And I tried to explain how you have to divert it, you can't move it too much. And he said, yeah, okay. So that was on a Wednesday. That Sunday, they made the front page of the Durango Herald. This is a picture from that. And a boulder, a debris flow came, knocked open their back door, and filled their house with water. So the following day, they made this giant berm at a nice steep angle to the debris flow. I don't have a good picture of it because it's private land, but this channel ended up incising almost 20 feet deep from the debris flow afterwards. And this is where Frechette did some of his research. All right, so let's switch to the 416 file. Here is the bird severity map, and I'm going to be talking specifically about Bell Canyon, where I did my engineering geology. So here is the hazard response map that their team made, and this is potentially high hazard for debris flows at Bell Canyon. Fortunately, there's no houses or structures, but there is a road and train tracks going through the bottom of Bell Canyon. So here they have severity, burn severity on the right, and there are a few patches of high burn severity in Bell Canyon. It's not a huge canyon, but it does have potential for debris flow. And I was not involved in this particular response map, so I put the citation at the bottom. They came up with a potential pre- and post-fire hydrograph of what they expected. So pre-fire on the small Bell Canyon, they expected about 5 cubic feet per second on the small little stream. Because of the erosion of the vegetation and the burn severity creating some hydrophobic soils, the post-fire hydrograph was looks like this. This is what they modeled, and it was going to go up to about 40 CFS. So quite a bit change in magnitude. So when I went there with my class, we went to go look at it. So here is the Bell Canyon debris flow after it ran in late August of last year. And I had my class look at it and try to figure out the volume of the debris flow that came down. And they had modeled that it would be about 40 CFS, and Sierra was looking at it, and we came up with numbers between 80 and 140 CFS, so it's quite a bit larger than they had modeled originally. Let me go back just a second here. So I wanted to show some of the other hazards with debris flow. Of course, it can cause problems for roads. This is the KOA where it filled the swimming pool and trapped a bunch of RVers. We had quite a bit of channel incision along the banks on Highway 550, as well as sheet flow erosion from the debris flows. We had channel incision, not necessarily down to bedrock, but quite a bit of incision. In some cases, it did get down to bedrock. And this is an interesting response. This is scarring from the debris flow on trees. And we can actually use the height of the scars on the trees to calibrate our models and see how deep the debris flow got and estimate volumes of these channels. So you can see that it's a very steep V-shaped channel, and there was a very distinct debris flow line that went up about 20 feet on either side. So it was relatively easy to determine at least the volume. We didn't know exactly what the velocity was, but we had to estimate that. And we did that based on the amount of debris at the bottom of the channel. So this is at the bottom of the channel where the train tracks are. This is after the train came through and cleared out the train tracks. It had completely covered them at the time. You can see the size of some of the boulders in the area, and we had to estimate the depth of the debris flow to come up with some volume estimates. You can see how large some of these boulders were. Very large. That's probably about 6 feet plus. So close to Bell Canyon, near the Mitchell Lakes, there's a homeowner who is a geologist and knew about the hazards of debris flow. And I took my class to talk to him. He was in Arizona at the time and heard about the fires and came right back because he knew that he had to mitigate for debris flow. So he bought all these giant blocks and cabled them together, concreted them together, to protect his house from this channel next to his house. I've got a little lead here. So he actually got him in before the flow. He got him in before the debris flow. Yeah. Oops. We happened to catch one of the debris flows as it was going past his mitigation. And this is the one that blocked Highway 550. It comes out just near where County Road 250 comes out to Maidens Bridge. That's doing very well.
Remember right, that was the remnants of a hurricane, that rainstorm.
I know it was monsoonal, but I don't quite
A
remember.
hurricane that hit Mexico. There we go.
All right, so here's some of the debris near County Road 250 and 550. Just a small pad for scale there. Some of the material. This is the debris flow that filled the pool at KOA. I think that's a bit more slideshow. So one of the things I wanted to conclude with is that when we get a disaster like a fire, we often think that it's over, and some of these are coincidence. So we'll have debris flows afterwards, and now that people are more aware of that, I think the response to the 416 fire was quite a bit better. I heard that they had quite a bit more money for debris flow mitigation from the government. The county got some kind of grant. I wasn't involved, but they did have some money for homeowners to do some debris flow mitigation before the debris flows hit after the fire.
In weeks, how long after the fire did these major debris flows? A couple of weeks?
It was about a month and a half. All right.
Thanks, Andy.
Scott.
Okay, this has been awesome so far. Really variety of information. Really pleased to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm an aquatic ecologist from Mountain Studies Institute, and particularly excited to be here for two reasons. One, I've got a 5-month-old baby at home, so thanks for giving me an adult night out. It's nice to be out of the house. I'm going to milk it for all I can. And then also, if you're a scientist, you get excited about data when you get data back from work you've been working on. And yesterday, I got an email back from the lab with some brand new data that we collected this summer. And I haven't gotten to share it with anyone until tonight. So I'm excited to share that with you toward the end of my presentation here. So I'm going to talk about, shift gears and talk about the 416 fire and its impact on water quality and aquatic life. And we've got a great research team that's kind of working into this with scientists from the Mountain Studies Institute and Colorado School of Mines, and also the U.S. Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station. And what are we looking at? Well, we're trying to look at the magnitude of impacts downstream of the fire on water quality and aquatic life. How great are the impacts? How far downstream do they persist? And how long are they going to persist? What's the recovery time it'll take before our fishery and aquatic life has recovered from this event? And there's three components of this work. One is instrumentation. And through the cross-basin generosity of a group called the Rio Grande Emergency Action Coordination Team that worked to study a similar study on the Rio Grande after the West Fork fire. They've loaned us some really nice instrumentation that we were able to deploy in our watershed to look at water quality parameters downstream of the fire, continuous measurements of pH, turbidity, temperature, and productivity. And then we have water quality sampling that we've done ever since the fire occurred. It occurred monthly, and we've tried to capture a variety of hydrological conditions, both during storm events, during the debris flows that Andy was talking about, as well as spring runoff, and then also in low flow scenarios. The interesting part of that work is that sometimes those storms come in the late afternoon up in the burn area, and it'll take 12 to 24 hours for that material to make its way down from Mosa Creek into the Animas River and get to Durango, which necessitates us setting alarms for 3 or 4 in the morning and getting out and going out on the river to collect water quality samples at that time of the day. And you can sometimes run into interesting folks out at that time of the night. And then the third component is benthic macroinvertebrate assessment. How many folks know what benthic macroinvertebrates are? Good number of you. All right. So it's the focus of a lot of my research, and they're the aquatic insects that live at the bottom of streams and rivers, and they're excellent indicators of changes in water quality. Where are we studying? Well, here's there in the kind of beige, brownish color is the 416 fire perimeter. And then these yellow dots are sampling sites that we have where we've deployed either instrumentation or collecting water quality samples. And then in all of these dots here are places where we looked at aquatic insect samples. And what's driven the site selection is one, having sites that are downstream of the fire, so that would be affected by the fire, and then some sites upstream of the fire and on Junction Creek that that are unburned, which serve as comparisons. And then also it's driven by where we have pre-fire data in terms of water quality and aquatic life. And so we started this work in June of 2018, right after the 416 fire started, and have continued it through 2019, and are hoping to continue it to be able to track this recovery of the system over time. So what are the possible impacts from wildfire on aquatic life and water quality? Really, it's well, during fire, it's obvious, right? You picture fire moving across the landscape, it's hot, it can heat up the stream channels in localized places, especially in smaller streams where there's less water volume. This is a tributary to Formosa Creek where you can see it burned right up to the stream. And in this actual section, Colorado Parks and Wildlife had a stream temperature monitor, a little gauge there, that survived the fire and actually recorded this huge spike in temperature as the fire came through. A high enough spike in temperature that would be detrimental to fish and aquatic life that live there. But really the biggest impacts are post-fire. They're what happens after the fire is gone. And as evidenced by Andy's presentation on debris flows, and what we see is a change in habitat. And the habitat for aquatic life is the stream bottom, right? Insects live on the bottom of the stream. Fish need to eat those insects. And also in the water column, things that come down the water. So let's start with the stream bottom. And I won't spend too much time on debris flows because we just talked a lot about it, but I will show you some pictures. Here's a gully that kind of split open the earth in the 416 fire this past year. And for scale, here's my bike helmet. So I'm about 5'8", and I had to reach up to get my bike helmet on the branch. So a huge kind of split open in the earth, and you can just envision the amount of material that's moving down. Similar pictures to Andy's and Julie's of erosion and incision down the bedrock, indicating the amount of material that's moving downstream. And a lot of the logs that come down these gullies end up in the stream channels and create these debris dams and log jams. And what happens behind that in stream channels is the accumulation of sediment. And really what you're seeing is a fundamental shift in the habitat that's available to aquatic life and systems that were previously dominated by, say, pebbles and cobbles and rocks that are favored by insects and fish. And you have this shift to kind of this muddy sediment and mud. So really it's a fundamental change in their habitat they live on. And then the other piece is the water column, right? Here's a video. Let's see if I can get, oh, that was easy. So this is a video of July 2018, I believe. One of the first rain events on Formosa Creek after the fire, and you can see it mobilized a lot of material moving down those gullies, moving down across the landscape and bringing trees and organic material down Formosa Creek. And you don't have to look into it much further to know that this would be detrimental to the organisms that live in these waters, right? Fish probably didn't like this. So, in kind of the bottom of the stream channel, you've got this scouring across the landscape and smothering of habitat, really covering these rocks and the interstitial spaces that fish need for spawning and insects need for living. And this, in the water column, this downstream transported materials, sediment, ash, wood. And then how does that affect aquatic life? There's kind of the obvious things of just thinking about all that material moving by. And actually, that obvious thing is probably what was most detrimental to aquatic life. Just material moving by and then breeding fish gills, and then toxicity from contaminants. And then there's sublethal impacts. Perhaps some organisms, some insects survived these events, but are they? Do they have reduced growth? Do they have reduced reproduction success? Are there changes in food resources? A lot of times, and I've been talking mostly about the stream channel, but if you think about the riparian forest, there's a lot of food resources in the riparian forest that insects thrive on and depend on. And when fire comes through, it eliminates that food resource. So there's a change in where their food may come from. And then how does that manifest itself in observations of these populations? Well, there could be a change in diversity, abundance, a shift in community structure, and there are sensitive fish and insects that are particularly sensitive to these type of events and can't survive. So you looked at those species and see how they did. So what have we actually observed so far after the 416 fire? I guess we're about a year out now. We looked at a host of water quality parameters from sediment, dissolved organic carbon, nutrients, and a whole host of metals. And I'm not going to dive too deeply into it, but what I want you to know, and it's fairly obvious, is that the water quality degraded during storm events demonstrated by fire, especially in terms of sediment, nutrients, and metals. And so what? When I look at any water quality data, so what if you have high levels of, say, aluminum, high levels of lead? What does it actually mean? There's two things I like to compare the data to. One is the historical context. What have we seen before, and how does it compare to that? And then secondly, how does it compare to water quality standards that are said to be protective of water quality based on toxicity experiments? So here's an example, in this case it's total aluminum. We're looking at the Amherst River Rotary Park in Durango, Colorado. And we have this great historical data set for a program called Colorado River Watch. And so we know what the aluminum concentration is, say, from 2002 roughly to 2014 there. Now, part of our context now in our stretch of the Amherst River, unfortunately, is this Gold Key mine release. And so here you see, as represented by these kind of yellow-orange dots, is the total aluminum concentrations that occurred during the pulse of the Gold Key mine coming through Durango. Here's what 2016 looked like, 2017, and then here's what we observed in 2018 last year. And these, these were debris flow events, storm events that brought a lot of material off the burns, got downstream into Durango, and there were fish kills associated with these events in July and September. And what I want you to see here is that not only were they high, they were really higher than anything we'd observed before, going back to 2002, including the 2015 Gold Key mine release. It's my built night out, so I get to have a sip of beer. I didn't bring any water. Anyway, and then you compare them to water quality standards. So Colorado Public Health and Environment has water quality standards, both acute and chronic. The acute standard is set to be protective of aquatic life in the Amherst River for brief, short-term exposure to contaminants. And you can see that represented here horizontally. And then with chronic, more persistent long-term exposure to contaminants. And you can see these storm events that brought these high concentrations of aluminum downstream were higher than anything we've seen before and higher than these water quality standards, indicating that there could be concern for aquatic life at that level of aluminum. And to summarize across kind of those water quality constituents, we saw possibly unprecedented concentrations of aluminum, manganese, iron, and mercury in 2018. And in terms of how they compare to water quality standards, they were high enough to be of concern for aquatic life for aluminum, iron, and mercury. And other parameters were at safe levels, which is important to know. So how did that affect aquatic life, excuse me? Well, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, we're lucky to have a very robust monitoring program with the Amherst River fishery, and they had pre-fire data as indicated by these kind of lighter blue columns. Brown trout, rainbow trout, I saw these enormous reductions in the abundance of those fish before and after the fire. But what I want you to know here is bluehead sucker, which is a native fish. There wasn't that much of a change in 2018 before and after the fire of that fish. And actually, when they came back to get these surveys in 2019, they still found a big reduction in these non-native trout species. But bluehead suckers actually had increased after the fire. And I think maybe you saw this in the paper, it was in some of the media, big fish kill, and there was a big fish kill, but I do think it's important to note that the native fish that are more adapted to this landscape and adapted to wildfire largely survived and maybe flourishing in this event. So what about aquatic insects? Well, in sites that we studied in closest proximity to the fire, say in Hermosa Creek itself, or in the Amateur River as it comes down into Durango, we saw reduced diversity of these insects and a shift in community composition. An example of this is this illustration from Hermosa Creek, downstream of the burn area, and I think this is pre-fire observation in 2016. You don't have to know much about these insects. Just think about these light blue or blue-colored ones. These are mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisflies that are more sensitive to contaminants moving downstream. And you see after the fire, those sensitive taxa that I just mentioned, the mayflies, caddisflies, stoneflies, are reduced and replaced by a community that's much more dominated by sediment-tolerant midges, for example. A real shift in community composition, at least in the short term after this event. Downstream, further downstream laterally, the impacts are much reduced. Even when you get into Durango and down into southern Indian tribe waters, we didn't see as large of an impact or impact at all on the insect communities. So, it always leads me to a question of if we see survival, are they thriving or are there possible sublethal impacts? Perhaps they're not actually going to reproduce, or maybe they are stressed enough that they're not going to complete their life cycle and metamorphose as adults. And so one thing we wanted to look at was the tissue concentration of these insects and see if it changed over time. We saw, as evidenced by some of the water quality data, there was a lot of aluminum, for example, coming downstream and other metals. Did these insects take those contaminants up into their body and then potentially have reduced success? So this is the brand new data that I haven't shared with anybody yet. So it's very exciting. I feel like we should do a drum roll, or at least in my own head. Okay, so it's very exciting. So I'm going to show you post-fire first, and these are 2019, so a whole year after the fire. These data were collected in September and even October of this year. This is tissue concentrations, and I'm going to show you aluminum first because that's one of the water quality parameters that we saw really high levels coming out of the fire. So Junction Creek is kind of our unburned reference, and so you can see kind of a relatively low level of aluminum in the tissue of insects there. Here's Hermosa Creek above the burn, up by Corral Draw. Yeah. And then this next one is going to be below the burn area. And you can see a lot more aluminum in the tissue, just compared above and below, and then also this kind of reference Junction Creek site. And then we move on to the Animus. I'm going to show you Baker's Bridge, which was largely unaffected by the fire, 32nd Street in Durango, which was, of course, downstream of the burn area, and Purple Cliffs is out by Walmart. Here's Baker's Bridge. You know, you would expect there to be a decent amount of aluminum there, given that it's downstream of the Superfund area, the PVP compliant district. Here's the Amish River at 32nd Street, downstream of the fire. Amish River Purple Cliffs, downstream of the fire. Well, these are looking across space, but what about across time? We're lucky that we do have some pre-fire data on this as well for some of these sites, not all of them. This is pretty inclusive here in that below the burn, before the fire, aluminum was only about this. It was pretty similar to Junction Creek, pretty similar to above the burn, and then you saw this big spike a year later. Baker's Bridge, actually before the fire, and after the fire, there was actually a little reduction after the fire. 32nd Street and Purple Cliffs, these are both locations that were affected by the fire. So we're actually seeing aluminum concentrations accumulating in the tissue of these insects that could be causing sublethal impacts. Now we're continuing this study. We've already made these collections in the fall of this year, and so those are working their way through our lab, and we'll have results of that coming up pretty soon to see how they fared a whole year after this fire. I was going to share some others. That was aluminum. Here's iron, a real similar story with iron. It was another water quality parameter that was really high coming off of the fire. Same with lead. Very similar situation. And then how have we seen recovery so far in 2019? Well, there is some good news here. The levels of most contaminants were highest so far in our study right after the fire. in 2018. Since then, they've been kind of tapering off. So we haven't seen as high a level of some of these water quality parameters in 2019, especially mercury. We saw a lot of mercury coming off the fire in 2018, and so far in 2019, we haven't seen hardly any mercury. And there's been improved habitat, signs of improved habitat already. You know, we had the big winter, big spring runoff, flushing a lot of the sediment out. You can see it kind of flushing the bank here and re-exposing some of this cobble, pebble, and gravel substrate that's more favorable for fish and bugs. Through some fish stocking surveys by Parks and Wildlife, as well as our insect surveys, we found that a lot of even native cutthroat trout, as well as native insect species, survive the fire within the burn area. And that's really important because those are the populations that we need to recolonize downstream and some of the sites, the places that were more effective. And then if you didn't get a chance to walk around the burn area, I just wanted to share this little piece. You know, you come across these beautiful meadows full of wildfires and tall grasses, and you look at it and you say, there's no way that burned. But if you stick your hands down in the grass and dig around, sure enough, it did burn, and it's already coming back. So there is a lot of recovery already going on within the burn area. And then lastly, I just want to thank, I don't know why it says thank. No, I turned it off. There was going to be a video there, but I just wanted to say that to wrap this up, that these landscapes, you know, have evolved with fire. They're adapted to fire, and in many cases need fire. And so, although we've seen a lot of impacts to water quality, to aquatic life, it really isn't that unexpected or that different from observations from other fires across the West. And I would say so far that what we've seen in terms of recovery of the fishery, recovery of native aquatic insects, and water quality is, I'm optimistic that we are on a trajectory toward recovery. Thanks.
Awesome. Well, huge thanks to all three speakers who spoke on three different aspects of science related to post-fire dynamics here in Southwest Colorado. Let's go ahead and just take a 10-minute break. If you need to refill your beverages, get some snacks, use the bathroom, whatever, think about what you just learned, and then we'll come back and have all three speakers up here for questions afterwards. And then Emily also has sign-in sheets. It'd be great to document everyone who came tonight. And also, we have some surveys over on the table that's labeled Mountain Studies Institute over in the back corner. And those surveys are really designed for us to understand how well we are reaching your interests. So if you fill out those surveys, that's super useful information for you. Take a quick break and we'll be back in just a moment.
Pardon?
Get that out.
It's good series. You guys worked out great. Science. Science.
I got one of your guys last week.
Guy, yeah, next job. Yeah, I gave credit for the amount of studies.
How are you?
Yeah, so I was curious, so I have a master's degree. And I was curious about experts sampling. When you, like, what was your sample size and out of that. Yeah, out of that. The 1 meter.
Anybody comparing West Spring with
Right. You got them on Monday. Yep. How many people do we have online?
That's one of the questions. Just because the slide you can't really see.
Yeah, well, that's.
Yeah, I know. I feel like I got
All right, so let's have our speakers come up here for the discussion portion of tonight. And while they're kind of coming up here and getting settled, I just kind of want to put a couple plugs in for upcoming events. Next week will be the last night of our forest learning series, and we'll shift gears for talking science and talk a little bit more about communities and what it means to be a community that lives in these fire-prone forests. So we'll have another great lineup of speakers that are a little more focused on the social aspects of fire. And then another event that I want to plug is on November 20th. We are going to, Mountain Studies Institute is going to host a celebration of recovering after the 416 fire and have a formal thank you to all the firefighters that responded to that event. Rob Powell, who was the communications manager of the 416 incident, will be coming to Durango to speak. Many of you, if you were around during that fire, were watching Facebook, and Facebook was hosting a series of videos every single morning where Rob Powell would update us on what was happening on fire and what operations were planned and how they were planning on tackling the event. So that evening, we will be hosting a fundraiser at the Strader Hotel, and Rob will be our keynote speaker, and we will have a variety of other speakers to talk about and celebrate what it means to have these post-fire events happen and what recovery of these fire sheds looks like. So tickets are available at the Mountain Studies website for that. And in the meantime, if we can steal Julie, we will start our panel discussion. And the way we'll do this is we'll just take questions from the audience. And if you want to ask a general question and get thoughts on general processes from all three speakers, that's fine. If you want to ask a question targeted at a specific speaker, that's great as well. And I'll try to repeat questions for people. We are streaming on Facebook Live, so I can repeat questions for them. And if you're on Facebook Live, feel free to comment with a question, and I can make sure that that gets brought up to our speakers. So, who wants to ask the first question?
I have a question for Scott. So,
Sure.
I work for San Juan Mountains Association and educate, do a lot with fourth graders and teaching them the effects, most of like the bulking line had on the Amherst River, but one question I'm not sure how to answer is, do you know how much of the benthic macroinvertebrates get replenished just from like basically getting flushed in from other streams, or like, how do we resupply the animals with macroinvertebrates?
That's a great question, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a great question. The question was, if you couldn't hear, how do benthic macroinvertebrates kind of recolonize after disturbance? You're exactly right. They move downstream. With the Gold King mine release, as well as with this 416 fire, we're lucky that there was upstream habitat that was unaffected, right? And so those populations were able to move downstream, downriver, and recolonize. Insects drift to disturbance in response to being disturbed, and they would, if they found that the habitat they were in was poor, they might lift off and drift in the water column downstream, looking for better habitat. And they do the same thing when they're wanting to move downstream to emerge to emerge as adults and lay eggs. So it depends on the species. Some of them will actually fly as adults to another watershed and lay eggs and disperse that way, but many of them will just disperse in the water column. Does that answer your question? And I expect that with the 416 fire that largely the upper Rustic Creek watershed didn't burn. There's great aquatic habitat upstream, and those insects are intact and will be able to move downstream and recolonize.
So, just speaking of the toxic contaminants, what's the source of these contaminants? Are they present in the soil and they're just concentrated, or how does that with the fires?
I can answer first, and then maybe I'll pass the mic to Julie. But yeah, these are largely naturally occurring contaminants that are sequestered in soil and vegetation, either through atmospheric deposition, and then they're released through the combustion, through fire, or through the disturbance that leads to these debris flows.
I had a different question. Okay. Thank you.
Smooth everything.
So like one of the things that I do for my job is like a lot of thinning chainsaws. So with regard to the stand density and like carbon percentage, and the canopy percentage, are we seeing that these fires are helpful toward restoring a healthier numbers on that, or not having an impact?
So with the 416, when I showed you stand densities, well, actually it was a missionary, I think, where I looked at, no, it was, yeah, so actually it was the 416, looking at the percent. And so actually, with fire, they talk about fire use, wildland fire use fires. And so even though the 416 wasn't considered a wildland fire use fire, from an ecology, kind of ecosystem forest health perspective, I would say that a lot of the 416 fire actually did accomplish some of the goals that I think that the Forest Service has as far as getting those stand densities within some historical range of natural variability to allow fire to then move through those systems. So yes.
That would have been a good prescribed burn.
It would have been, for the majority of the area, yes, it would be a good, and a lot of that, I mean, one of the things when I was talking to some students today about the 416 and the burn perimeter, a bunch of that, I think it was like 15,000 acres, was actually from backfires. So when they're trying to contain the fire itself, that a lot of people say, okay, it's some thousand acres, that was all from that ignition source. But really, a lot of it is just through the fire management. So trying to, get a black zone, remove those fuels, and so a lot of that burn perimeter was actually through using back burns. So essentially, it wasn't a prescribed fire. It was just used to stop or remove fuel so that the fire could not keep going on its own, but they had more control of it. Yes.
I'm curious, the difference in fire, the relatively small portion of high intensity fire in the 416 fire. Can we estimate, have we looked at how that correlates to prescribed fire that was put on the ground in Hermosa Creek, or other stand conditions that might have impacted, the fire severity, or do we think that was really just driven by weather and fire behavior? I'm just kind of curious. It's really, both years were pretty historically dry from a weather perspective, and yet we see really different percentages of fire severity between Missionary Ridge and the 416 fire. I'm just curious if we know anything about why, because there were some different management tools that had been used in the Hermosa Creek watershed prior to the 416 fire.
Does everyone hear the question?
No.
No? Okay. So the question was, well, in a gist, it was long. What variables could have been driving the differences in burn severity? So I pointed out that in the Missionary Ridge fire, the high burn severity was about 30%, and moderate was 30%. But then when we look at the 416, it was 30% moderate, 3% high. And given that, essentially it's across the street, it's across the road, 550, and it's similar climate, similar topography, what's going on. I know Mike maybe talked to you, there was a prescribed fire, what year was that?
2008.
2008, and so you put some plots in and outside of that prescribed burn area?
Yeah, so our sampling scheme that Julie sampled on is attempting to try to understand some of those prescribed fire dynamics. But I also did some spatial analyses with the burn severity looking inside and outside of the prescribed fire. What I can say for 416 is the biggest driver in fire behavior was fuel. With the exception of what was happening on the east side of Hermosa Cliffs, adjacent to the highway, that fire was driven by fuel. It didn't matter if there was the prescribed fire or not. It just burned where there was ponderosa pine is low severity, where there was dry mixed conifer is low to moderate severity, and where there was cool moist mixed conifer, it burned hot. So it was a fuel-driven fire. And that's even true where Julie was just describing where they had fire management, where they were putting ping pongs on the ground to back burn, right? Missionary Ridge, Julie can maybe speak to this some too, but Missionary Ridge was very different, and then it was more of a weather-driven fire than just a fuel-driven fire. So those high severity patches were created by big wind events that were pushing that fire across the landscape. The other thing that was different too is 416, we had priority resources in the state of Colorado. Missionary Ridge, less than 2 days after that fire started, the Hayman fire started. So priority resources were pulled. And that fire had a little more freedom to just burn as it could across that landscape without back burning operations, without some of these other more aggressive suppression techniques that 416 had. The 2008 prescribed fire is really hard to speak to in terms of the effects because we didn't have monitoring pre and post that fire, so we don't know what was going on with fuel loads throughout those 10 years. But great question.
Yeah, like Mike's, so if you look, so in fire ecology, if you look, there's the fire triangle, what it takes to have fire, then the fire behavior triangle, and at the bottom of that, like the common leg between the fire triangle and the fire behavior triangle is fuel. And then in fire behavior, you have topography and weather. And so like Mike was saying, the 416 is predominantly driven by fuel, where in the Missionary Ridge, it was wind driven. I remember we lived up in Forest Lakes at the time, and it was coming over Lemon and just collapsed and literally jumped all, by Aceto, and ended up on Grassy Mountain going into New Forest Lakes. And so that was definitely a weather driven fire. And also there were a lot higher elevation sites that burned for Missionary too. So again, when I was showing you the figure and I was talking about our low and moderate, how is ponderosa pine dominated, and then when we got to the high, it was dominated by Douglas fir, white fir, and aspen. kind of that cool mix. And then at Missionary, there was a lot of subalpine. So, on top of Missionary Ridge, last year, I went out with MSI when we did a tour of the 416 and Missionary Ridge Fire, and we were planting blue spruce up there at these really high elevation sites. So, and those areas historically did burn as stand replacement fire. So it's not that that was unusual for that first forest type to burn. So I think you kind of have to look at all those different variables. That's a great question.
I just want to make sure that I'm following Dr. Korb's slides and so ask a question. The comparison of abundance and size distributions of trees in year 1 versus year 15 post-fire suggests or indicates that there is significant levels of mortality during that 15-year period. And that, with the exception of aspen trees, that this mortality is more severe with the increasing severity of the fire.
Correct.
That strikes me as counterintuitive. And I'm just looking for an understanding of why that is. Why are we seeing so much mortality? And also, why does that post-fire mortality of these recruits to these areas seem to be worse with fire intensity? I would have thought that those spaces where things have been able to grow again and propagate again would have had less competition and an abundance of nutrients and such from the fire.
So your question was asking that you were trying to understand the difference. So this is referring to Missionary Ridge, looking at post 1 and post 15, looking at tree mortality. So there's two different things going on though. It sounds like you were asking about tree mortality and then also looking at regeneration, because the tree mortality that we were seeing I wish I could pull up my slide, but the tree mortality is where 1 year post-fire, so if the tree, it's considered alive, so it could, if we give it a Forest Service classification, they have a scale of 1 to 7, so they might call it declining. But it's still, when we do the analysis, it's considered alive. And so maybe it had 20% crown that was living, and those trees then end up, basically they were susceptible to then later on dying. And so that's why we're seeing that, in low severity, maybe on average, the canopy crown, 50% of the canopy crown was affected by the fire. And so that's one of the things that I was saying that Mike and I are hoping to figure out with the 416 fire is so that land managers can not just have this classification of live or dead, but basically say, okay, really what we're interested in is what is the percent crown canopy for each of those burn severities? Because that's going to give us a better indication of whether or not those trees are actually going to survive or not. Then what is the threshold in Southwest Colorado? Is it 30%? You have 30% remaining live canopy crown cover post-fire that tree is going to survive. Obviously, it's still going to have effects on what the climate is following the fire. Is it a south-facing slope? Is it low elevation, high elevation? All those other variables are going to play, but it would be nice to have some type of number to give land managers as a threshold of, okay, this is what we're seeing, and this is the percent mortality we can expect based on looking at that live crown. So does that help?
I think it does, and just make sure that I follow this, that year 1 assessment can contain new recruits as well as regenerative growth from trees that may not have been about.
Correct.
I want to follow up on this fuel or weather-based fire things. I'm just curious about the topographic piece of it. My observation from roaming around the fire is that topography played quite a it was a big player basically in severity, high severity fire. When you look at where you say like in Dutch Creek or where it ran up to the south side of Hermosa Creek or in Tripp, those were places, it seems like, in other words, when you had lots of steeper slopes, you had a higher, that's supposed to be a greater concentration of higher severity. Is that
Yeah,
true,
and that's,
or?
yeah, that's just, and that's just a
I mean,
common,
besides, I mean, beyond what the force type was, that
right,
was.
exactly, but it's just a general fire principle. I mean, if you think about, you know, this is what I do with my students, I like to show things. So, you know, here's a flat slope, you have the flame. I don't know if I can do this up right. So here's the flame, right? So basically, it's not connected to the slope. The minute the slope gets steep, then the flame can attach itself to the slope. And so what it essentially does is it preheats. I mean, so fire is not one event. Fire is multiple events happening together. So the first stage, in order for fire to happen, is it has to preheat those adjacent fuels. So when you have those flames, when they are closer to the slope, right? So when they're closer to the slope, they're attached, and so it can preheat those fuels in front, because instead of that heat energy going straight up into the atmosphere, it's moving across the vegetation, and so all of those fuels in front of it are drying out, and so it's this rapid combustion that's happening. So that's exactly what's going on. I mean, when you get those flames attached on those steep slopes, it just allows it to rip, because it's allowing those series of events that need to happen for fire to occur much more rapidly.
So it sort of modifies the fuel factor in a sense, right?
Right.
Thank you.
Yes.
Do you have information on how these two fires that you've been talking about, size-wise, compare to wildfires and fires in the history of Colorado?
Well, the one thing we know is that the fire, so there was just a report that just came out, and it was talking about, so it's not even, so the number of ignitions there's an increase in the number of ignitions, but really what's going on, it's the size of these fires that's larger than they were in the past. We're seeing more area burn. And so that, I think, is one of the concerning factors, that these fires, it's not that there's necessarily, well, both is happening. There are more fires, but it's really the size and the intensity and then the severity of the effects that we're seeing.
Is that compared to historic fires or prehistoric fires?
That's looking at like prior to your American settlement, 1880s.
So
In this area.
just to get the mic out of Julie's hands, I want to ask Andy a question and build off of your question. Andy, you mentioned studies that have shown that over 4,000 years, every 300 to 400 years, there's a charcoal layer that's affiliated with a fire, right? So what else can we infer from that charcoal layer and its affiliated debris flow? Is there a climatic signal also potentially associated with that fire? And are those fires that are leaving those charcoals similar in scope to what the Missionary Ridge or the 416 fire were, or were they a fire of a different nature?
Well, they didn't infer what type of fire it was. They could look at the depth of the charcoal layer to infer how big it was, but you can't really tell what the burn severity was just from a charcoal layer in one soil thing. It could have been a climatic response, but the analysis didn't actually look at that, whether it was climatic. But you do know that the geomorphic response is related to those fires, and whether it's the fuel buildup over that time that controlled it, or climatic, there hasn't been any analysis.
Sure. Something.
Can I follow up on that?
Yeah.
It's just, has anybody ever tried to correlate that with burn scars in trees and the tree cores and that kind of stuff?
Not in the studies that I've seen.
No, I haven't. So Erica, did you know I just about her?
Yeah, I showed her.
Did you show? Okay.
Yeah, I showed Erica
Okay.
as well.
Yeah.
Her analysis showed that she thought that the Missionary Ridge fire was one of the largest in the last 2,000 years. So larger than other events that occurred. And I don't know the causation behind it.
Sure. Great. That provides some great historical context.
I will add one thing that actually at the end of Vermont studies gave me information that spruce fir forests tend to burn every 300 to 400 years, which seems to correlate with that data that you have in the ponderosa fir much more.
Yeah, I mean, it's more around, I think, 200, but I mean, it's gonna vary. Everything's gonna vary depending on slope, aspect, elevation, climate.
It's a different fire than the two that you guys discussed, but how do these two fires compare to the Mesa Verde fire? It was in like 2006, 2007? Because that's a different fuel source and it's in a different area, but it's still close enough to us here where I don't know if you guys have done studies that we'd be able to see the different maps and stuff of those.
So Bill Rami and Lisa Boyd-Hanna, they've done a lot of research with the fires at Mesa Verde. And one of the things that's interesting with pinyon juniper, so that's the predominant habitat there, and then chaparral, is that we have 3 different types of pinyon juniper forests in this region. And so the message gets the message is a little messier, I guess, because we have a pinyon juniper grassland, we have a pinyon juniper woodland, and then we have a pinyon juniper old growth. And so at Mesa Verde, the forest type is pinyon juniper old growth. And so at Mesa Verde, based on the topography is one of the driving factors as far as why the fire regime was different and why we were able to get old growth forests up on Mesa Verde, because it's so dissected. Up in that area, the fires are wind driven. And so essentially in pinyon juniper forest, you either get one tree that burns or it's going to burn in these old growth forests. And so those naturally, historically have been stand replacing fires. And the way they've been able to look at that is they look at different ages of the forest, and they're able to map out the size of these burn patches, and then they look at a replacement or a return interval that way. So it's a little different than looking at ponderosa pine where you get fire scars and you can actually date it. There, the only way you can get a better understanding of how often fire happened is looking at different age classes of the forest in those regions. And so the stand replacing fires that we've seen at Mesa Verde, those are the type of fires that historically happen at Mesa Verde. Either, like I said, a tree would burn or a big area. One of the things that Bill Rami has shown is that it's kind of, well, this is some of his work in the early 2000s, that at the time, the extent or the area of burn hadn't increased, so it wasn't outside of that historical range of natural variability, but it was kind of getting to a tipping point where we were having more ignitions and more fires, and that's where you would see that crossover, because it takes a really long time for pinon trees and junipers. I mean, you can have a 50-year-old pinon tree that might be 6 inches tall that has a root system that's, 6 feet deep. And so it's really limited by those dry environments. So what's going on up at Mesa Verde is a little different.
Well, I'll follow up. I'll stick my neck out. My understanding is there's some controversy there that if Mesa Verde has stand clearing fires, the species will go extinct. And that Romney and Hannah based their analysis, their estimates of the previous fires on a statistical distribution that was highly sensitive to the limited data that was available. And why would there be fewer ignitions in pinyon juniper than there is in ponderosa habitat that's immediately adjacent to it?
Well, I think, so again, it goes back to that fire behavior model, looking at the topography, and it's also soil. So if you drive the road, I can't remember what it is, from Mancos over to Dolores, on one side, on the, I guess it's the north side of the road, it's primarily ponderosa pine. On the south side, it's primarily pinon, and you're like, okay, well, the climate's the same, everything's the same, the topography is the same, but it's that soil type. So there's a variation in soil type that's affecting the different vegetation that's growing there, the dominant trees. But it has to have some type of fuel source. And so the only way that you could the other way of looking at that is how can you get old growth trees if fire's coming through these areas repeatedly? So pinon trees and juniper trees, they don't have thick bark, so if they ignite, those trees are going to die. So if we look going back, 1,000 years, the only way we're going to be able to get 400-year-old trees is if fire wasn't happening very frequently on that landscape, because otherwise those trees would burn and they would die.
Or the stand density was much less, the grasses were thick, and it was.
Well, and up on Mesa Verde, it's basically a patchy distribution. So you have pinon trees, juniper trees, and the interspaces between those trees, there's not a lot of grasses growing. You're not getting a lot of shrubs growing in those interspaces to carry the fire. So that's why up on Mesa Verde, it's primarily a wind-driven fire, that there's a ton of lightning strikes. So there's been a lot of mapping that's been done on Mesa Verde, and there's plenty of ignition sources. It's just unless you have that associated wind to drive. So it's kind of the same thing that I was using with my slope. Slope and wind basically do the same thing, right? They allow that flame to attach, to basically bend, and that's what was going on in the Missionary Ridge fire. It just allows all those fuels in front to go through that first stage, the pre-ignition stage. And so it has to go through those different stages before ignition can happen. And by having that wind driving, that's how you get those fires up at Mesa Verde.
I think something else that's important that Julie mentioned early on in this conversation about pinyon junipers, there's a lot of different types of pinyon juniper forests, right? There's pinyon juniper savanna, there's woodlands, and everything in between. And comparing pinyon juniper to the mesa top at Mesa Verde is very different than pinyon juniper on Canyon Bottom in the Dolores River Canyon. And both of those are very different than pinyon juniper at Cedar Mesa in Utah, and that is very different than pinyon juniper in northern Arizona and Flagstaff. So Bill Rami and Lisa Floyd Hanna have studied pinyon juniper extensively in southwest Colorado, but southwest Colorado is very different than places where like Dave Huffman and George Koch have studied pinyon juniper in northern Arizona. So the variation that exists in PJ alone is extreme, and therefore thinking about fire in pinyon juniper also has a lot of variation in how fire is going to interact and behave, right? So the fuels are going to be very different, the topography is going to be very different, and potential fire weather and fire ignition is going to be very different.
And there's some good historical photos, especially at Mesa Verde, from the early 1900s, showing stand density above like Spruce Tree House, and you look at a photo of it today, and essentially it looks the exact same. And so if where you can look at pinyon juniper down in New Mexico, or like Mike said, in northern Arizona, where you're looking at the pinyon juniper grasslands. In those areas, you can do photo series, and there's big encroachment. There's a big increase in stand density due to fire being removed from those systems. And they burn more frequently because they had those flashy fuels of the grasses to carry that fire, but they didn't have to be wind driven. And again, you can have the topography that was dissecting that pretty much when it hit that barrier that the fire would go out.
One more question and then we'll call it a night.
Is pinyon also a fire species with cone opening, you believe, like on those
So the only kind that we have in the Southwest, well, and really lodgepole, I think we have it up on Falls Pass, but it was planted during the Lime Creek burn, so it's not even native. Basically, aspen and lodgepole pine, they play the same role as an early successional species post-fire. So farther south here, and then in New Mexico, aspen is predominant species, but as you move farther north, central Colorado up into Wyoming, like at Yellowstone National Park when the fires happened in 1988, that's where lodgepole is more common. So lodgepole is the pine species that we have in the West that has serotinous cones that essentially has a wax on it, and then when the fire comes through, it melts that wax, and it's adapted that it likes this, blackened soil surface to absorb that solar radiation, and then that helps those seeds germinate and then get established.
So pinyon is cone opening kind of.
No, so pinyon pine is not a serotinous cone. It does not need fire in that way. It didn't evolve with fire that way to get established.
All right, well, thanks everyone for coming, and thanks to our speakers for participating. Just one last reminder, we do have surveys. I'll put these somewhere convenient. If you don't mind filling one of these out on your way out the door, this information is really helpful to make sure we're meeting your interests and your needs for future events. So if you have the time, fill one out on your way out. Otherwise, thanks a ton for coming. And if you have more questions, feel free to contact one of our speakers or grab them right before they leave. Or also, I have business cards available. You can contact myself or other folks at MSI. Thanks again.